War had a strange way of making ordinary places feel permanent. The outpost drifting above the pale moon of Orpheus 9 had originally been constructed as a temporary checkpoint. That had been 6 years ago. Now the station creaked like an old cargo ship every time its rotation engines adjusted, and the soldiers stationed there had begun arguing about which hallway smelled the least like burnt wiring. Corporal David Hayes had drawn the night shift again. The assignment board insisted it was random. David suspected the board hated him personally. The detention corridor was quiet except for the low humming of the containment fields. Transparent energy barriers stretched across each holding cell, glowing faintly blue. The prisoners inside ranged from captured pirates to smugglers who had tried to sneak experimental weapons across the border. None of them were particularly interesting, except for the last cell. David leaned back in his chair, boots resting against the edge of the security console. He held a metal cup of station coffee, staring at it with the same cautious respect one might give an unexploded grenade. "I still think it's impressive," a voice said calmly from behind the energy barrier. David didn't turn immediately. Which part? That humans discovered faster than light travel before discovering how to make drinkable coffee. He sighed and finally glanced toward the prisoner. "You've mentioned that. I feel it deserves repetition." The alien woman sat on the narrow bench inside the containment cell with surprising composure. If someone ignored the long, elegant ears rising through her dark hair, she could have passed for human. Her posture was calm, almost royal. She watched the corridor with quiet curiosity, as if she were a visitor observing a museum exhibit rather than a prisoner awaiting execution. Her name in the database was Kestrel. David took a careful sip of the coffee. His face tightened. "You see," she said gently, "your expression confirms my argument." "You're lucky you're behind a force field," David muttered. "Otherwise, I'd make you try this stuff." "I already did. That is why I am still criticizing it." Despite himself, David chuckled quietly. It had been 3 days since the Valeran prisoner had arrived on the station, and she had not behaved the way enemy operatives were supposed to behave. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't rant about Imperial glory. She didn't even complain about the cramped cell. Instead, she asked questions. Lots of them. Most prisoners demanded things. Kestrel asked things like, why humans put sugar in everything, why soldiers decorated their helmets with small drawings, and why the station's artificial gravity occasionally made the hallway lights flicker. David tapped a control panel beside him. A holographic report flickered briefly above the console. The official charge listed beside her name was severe enough to make any officer nervous. War crimes, mass civilian casualties, strategic sabotage. He glanced at her again. She was currently examining a small maintenance drone that hovered near the ceiling. The machine beeped softly as it scanned the corridor walls. Kestrel tilted her head slightly, studying the drone like someone observing a curious insect. "Does it have a name?" she asked. "It's a maintenance unit." "So no name?" "No." "That seems rude." David shook his head. "You're the first prisoner I've met who worries about the feelings of cleaning robots." "They work very hard," she said. The drone rotated slowly and drifted away. For a moment, the corridor fell silent again. Outside the observation window at the far end of the hallway, the moon of Orpheus 9 glowed softly against the endless darkness of space. The stars beyond it looked cold and distant, scattered across the black like fragments of broken glass. Kestrel eventually spoke again. "Corporal Hayes." He blinked. "How do you know my name? You talk in your sleep." David nearly dropped his coffee. "I do not. You said it earlier while reading the duty roster." He relaxed slightly. "That's less embarrassing." "Marginally." David rubbed his forehead. "You're very calm for someone scheduled to be executed tomorrow," he said quietly. Kestrel's gaze drifted toward the stars beyond the window. "Calmness," she replied, "is sometimes the only useful response to an unfortunate schedule." "That's one way to look at it." She studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You are wondering whether the accusations are true." David didn't answer immediately. The station's ventilation system hummed softly above them. Finally, he said, "I'm wondering why someone responsible for mass murder spends her time complaining about coffee and defending cleaning drones." "That is a very good question," Kestrel said. "And And you might discover the answer if you continue asking questions. David leaned back in his chair again, staring at the glowing containment field. Somewhere deep in the station, an alarm chimed briefly as a cargo shuttle docked with the outer ring. War had filled the galaxy with enemies, but at that moment, staring at the alien woman with the long ears calmly sitting in her cell, David found himself thinking something deeply inconvenient. She did not look like a monster. She looked like someone waiting for the universe to catch up with the truth. The station's artificial morning arrived without sunlight. Instead, the corridor lights slowly brightened from dim blue to sterile white, accompanied by a soft chime from the intercom system that sounded far too cheerful for a military facility orbiting a war zone. Corporal David Hayes had not slept. He sat at the security console with his arms crossed, staring at the glowing containment field that separated him from the prisoner at the end of the corridor. Kestrel, meanwhile, appeared extremely well rested. She stood beside the transparent barrier, watching the artificial sunrise with mild curiosity, as if she had paid admission to a slightly disappointing theater performance. "Your station simulates morning very politely," she said. David rubbed his eyes. "It's not polite, it's a schedule." "Schedules are polite lies," she replied. "They pretend time is organized." David sighed and glanced at the console again. The execution order was still there in the system. Scheduled, 1900 station time. He had read the file so many times during the night that the letters were beginning to blur together. "Did you stay awake all night reading that report?" Kestrel asked suddenly. David looked up. "How would you know that?" "You kept sighing." "I sigh normally." "You sigh like someone who is discovering unpleasant truths." David stared at her for a moment. "You're very observant for someone behind a force field." "Observation is free entertainment." He leaned back in his chair again. "I read the case file," he said quietly. Kestrel nodded slightly as if this was expected. "Then you discovered the strange parts." "There are a lot of strange parts," David replied. "The evidence is incomplete. Witness statements contradict each other. Half the timestamps don't match." She tilted her head. "And yet the execution order is very enthusiastic." "Exactly." David tapped the console and a holographic display flickered briefly in the air. Lines of data scrolled past like silent accusations. "According to this," he continued, "you orchestrated a bombing on a civilian research colony." Kestrel looked thoughtful. "That sounds dramatic." 2,000 casualties." "Yes," she said calmly. "Very dramatic." David stared at her. "You're not denying it?" "I am not confirming it either." "That's not helpful. Truth rarely arrives in convenient sentences." David let out a tired breath. Outside the observation window, the stars drifted slowly as the station rotated. Somewhere deep in the hull, cargo loaders hummed while moving supply crates through the lower decks. "Let me ask you something," David said. Kestrel waited. "If you didn't do it, why haven't your people demanded your release?" She smiled faintly. "That assumes they know I am here." "You're telling me the Valeran Empire lost track of one of their agents?" "Oh, they did not lose track," she said gently. David frowned. "Then why are you still here?" Kestrel walked slowly to the edge of the containment barrier and placed her hand against the glowing energy field. The light reflected softly across her face. "Because," she said, "some people in my empire wanted me here." David blinked. "That makes absolutely no sense." "Politics rarely does." He leaned forward slightly. "You're saying your own people set you up?" "I am saying," she replied calmly, "that power often finds creative ways to remove inconvenient voices." David sat back again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kestrel looked toward the security console. "What does the coffee taste like today?" David groaned. "Still terrible." "That is comforting." "How is that comforting?" "It means some things in the universe remain consistent." David stared at the cup in his hand. "You know, you're scheduled to die tonight." "Yes, and you're discussing coffee." "Execution schedules are stressful," she said. "Coffee criticism helps." David laughed despite himself. "You're either the bravest prisoner I've ever met or the strangest." "Possibly both." Another long silence filled the corridor. David glanced again at the execution order, glowing faintly on the console. His mind replayed the contradictions in the report. Missing evidence, rushed procedures, witnesses who had never actually seen the accused. It felt wrong, not slightly wrong, dangerously wrong. You said something yesterday, he muttered. Kestrel raised an eyebrow. I say many things. You said the galaxy eventually catches up with human courage. Yes. What did you mean? Kestrel studied him quietly. For the first time since her arrival, her calm expression carried something heavier beneath it. Not fear, expectation. It means, she said softly, that sometimes one small decision changes events far beyond the person making it. David frowned. That sounds like something philosophers say after disasters, or after miracles. He rubbed his temples. You realize I'm already in trouble just for talking with you this much. You are a very rebellious guard. I am not rebellious. You are questioning authority while holding terrible coffee, she said. That is practically the human definition. David chuckled. You're impossible. Not impossible. She looked at the containment field. Just temporarily imprisoned. David followed her gaze. The energy barrier shimmered faintly, powered by a control system sitting quietly beneath his console. He had stared at that system all night. A single command could deactivate it. Just for a moment. Just long enough. David swallowed slowly. You know what would happen if I released you, he said. Yes. I'd lose my career. Yes. I'd probably face a court-martial. Almost certainly. David looked up. You're very calm about ruining my life. Kestrel smiled gently. I did not ask you to ruin it. He stared at the glowing field between them. But if you chose to, she added quietly, the universe might become very interesting. The decision did not feel heroic. It felt quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. Corporal David Hayes sat at the security console, staring at the glowing controls that regulated the containment field. The interface floated in the air like a calm blue ghost, waiting patiently for instructions. Behind the energy barrier, Kestrel sat cross-legged on the narrow bench, as if she were in a peaceful waiting room instead of a prison cell scheduled for execution. Your station hums differently today, she said casually. David blinked. What? The engines, she replied. They sound nervous. That's not a thing. It is absolutely a thing. He rubbed his eyes. He had slept for approximately 11 minutes sometime around dawn, and his brain felt like it had been microwaved. The execution order still blinked on the console. 1900 hours. 7 hours left. David stared at the command panel again. A single sequence could disable the containment field. 3 steps. 4 if he wanted the system to log it as a maintenance error instead of deliberate sabotage. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. You're thinking loudly again, Kestrel said. That's not possible. You are tapping your fingers in a pattern. That's stress. Stress has rhythm. David stopped tapping. For a moment the corridor filled with silence again, broken only by the distant mechanical groan of the station rotating around the moon outside. He looked toward her cell. You're still very calm about dying, he said. Kestrel tilted her head. I told you earlier, schedules are polite lies. That sentence is starting to worry me. Good. That's not reassuring. She smiled faintly. You humans believe control is permanent. My people learn early that control is temporary. Temporary like war? Yes. Temporary like prison? Yes. Temporary like execution orders? Especially those. David leaned forward slightly. You're very confident for someone locked behind a force field. Kestrel stood slowly and walked toward the glowing barrier. The blue light reflected across her face, outlining the long, elegant curve of her ears. I am confident, she said quietly, because history is moving. That sounds poetic and suspicious. It is both. David sighed. Do all Valaren talk like philosophers? No. So you're the weird one. That is possible. David turned his chair back toward the console. The control interface hovered patiently. Deactivate containment field. He stared at the command line. You realize something, he muttered. Kestrel waited. If I open this cell, you could be lying. Yes. You could be a war criminal. Yes. You could escape and kill half the station. That seems inefficient, she said thoughtfully. David rubbed his forehead. You're not helping. I am being honest. That's the problem. He leaned back again, staring at the ceiling. Back on Earth, he said slowly. My instructor told me soldiers survive by following orders. Did that work? Usually. And when it didn't? David smirked slightly. That's when things got interesting. Kestrel studied him carefully. You enjoy interesting things. I enjoy not getting court-martialed. Those two interests may conflict today. He laughed quietly. That's becoming obvious. A maintenance drone drifted slowly down the corridor again, scanning the floor panels with a faint red beam. Kestrel watched it pass. Does the cleaning robot have a name yet? She asked. No. That seems rude. David shook his head. You might be the only prisoner in military history worried about the emotional well-being of maintenance equipment. They deserve appreciation. They vacuum metal dust. Important metal dust. David chuckled again. The humor made the tension worse somehow, because beneath it, the decision remained. The console blinked. The command waited. Finally, David leaned forward. His fingers hovered above the controls. You're about to make the most irresponsible decision of your career, he said. Yes, Kestrel replied. You sound excited. I am curious. That's worse. He entered the first command. The console beeped quietly. Warning icons appeared. Containment integrity, unstable. He paused. His heart thumped in his chest. You still have time to stop, Kestrel said calmly. That's not helpful. You should know you have a choice. I know I have a choice. Good. David exhaled slowly. Then he entered the second command. The humming of the containment field shifted slightly, like a machine clearing its throat. The blue barrier flickered. Interesting, Kestrel murmured. Stop saying that word. Why? Because I'm committing treason. Technically, disobedience. That's not better. David entered the final command. The containment field collapsed with a soft electronic sigh. The glowing barrier vanished. For the first time since her arrival, Kestrel stood in the open corridor. Neither of them moved. The station lights hummed overhead. David slowly stood from the chair. Well, he said. Kestrel stepped forward cautiously. You did it. I might be an idiot. That is still under debate. She looked at the open hallway stretching toward the station docks. Then she turned back toward him. You understand what happens next. Alarms, David said. Yes. Arrest. Very likely. Court-martial. Almost certainly. David crossed his arms. You're very calm about this. Kestrel studied him with an expression that almost looked like pride. Corporal Hayes, she said gently, you just changed several governments' plans. That's not comforting. She walked toward the far end of the corridor. Halfway there, she stopped. Thank you, she said quietly. David shrugged. If you start a war with this, I'm going to be very annoyed. Kestrel smiled. I am hoping for the opposite. Then a small silver device appeared in her hand. She pressed it. Space outside the observation window shimmered. A sleek alien transport craft decloaked silently beside the station. David blinked. You had a spaceship parked outside this whole time? Yes. That would have been useful information earlier. You did not ask. He groaned. Kestrel stepped toward the airlock. Before leaving, she turned back one last time. The galaxy moves slowly, she said. Then she grinned. But today it may start running. The alarms began exactly 32 seconds after Kestrel disappeared through the airlock. David knew the timing because he counted every second while staring at the empty corridor and wondering if he had just made the most spectacular mistake in human military history. Red lights flooded the hallway. The calm blue glow of the station was replaced by flashing, warning strobes that made the metal walls look like they were bleeding. A mechanical voice echoed through the corridor. Security breach detected. Containment field failure in Detention Sector 3. David leaned against the console and sighed. Well, he muttered, that escalated quickly. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. 3 security officers rounded the corner with rifles raised. Their helmets were still half unclipped, suggesting they had been enjoying a peaceful breakfast before the universe decided otherwise. Sergeant Molina stopped first. She looked at the empty cell, then at the dead containment field, then at David. Hayes, she said slowly. David raised his hand in a small wave. Morning. Where is the prisoner? He glanced toward the observation window where the stars drifted quietly across the darkness. Technically? Yes, technically. She left. Melina stared at him. Left? Yes. You're saying the alien war criminal scheduled for execution simply left? David nodded. That's the general idea. The other guards exchanged confused looks. One of them stepped closer to the cell, checking the barrier controls. Containment field manually disabled, he reported. Melina looked back at David. Did you do that? David thought about pretending to faint. It seemed like a reasonable strategy. Unfortunately, he had never practiced fainting. Yes, he said. Melina blinked once. You released the prisoner. Yes. Without orders. Yes. Do you understand how incredibly stupid that sounds? Extremely. Another alarm echoed somewhere deep in the station as docking clamps disengaged. The guards glanced toward the observation window just in time to see a sleek silver craft detach from the outer hull and slip silently into space. Everyone in the corridor watched it vanish among the stars. One of the guards slowly lowered his rifle. That's not good, David shrugged. Depends on your perspective. Melina pinched the bridge of her nose. Hayes, please tell me you have a brilliant explanation. I have several terrible explanations. Pick one. David opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again. I think she was innocent. The silence that followed was impressive. One guard actually laughed. He stopped quickly when Melina glared at him. You released an enemy operative, she said slowly, because you think she was innocent. She didn't seem like a mass murderer. That is not a scientific method. She also hated our coffee. That is not evidence. David raised a finger. It is circumstantial. Melina stared at him. You're going to prison. Yes. Possibly for a very long time. I assumed that part. 2 more soldiers arrived and began securing the corridor. Within minutes, David's wrists were wrapped in a magnetic restraint band. The device hummed softly as it locked. He glanced down at it. Comfortable, he said. Melina shook her head. I can't believe you did this. Honestly, neither can I. They escorted him through the station corridors while alarms continued flashing overhead. Crew members stopped and stared as the small procession passed. Some looked confused. Some looked impressed. One engineer whispered, Is that the guy who let the alien out? David gave him a small thumbs up. The engineer returned the gesture with obvious admiration. Melina groaned. Stop encouraging him. They reached the command level 20 minutes later. The tribunal chamber was already active. Officers, analysts, and military legal staff filled the room with tense whispers. When David was pushed inside, every conversation stopped. Admiral Renner stood at the center table. His expression could have melted metal. Corporal Hayes, the admiral said slowly. David stood at attention. Sir, did you release the Valeran prisoner? Yes, sir. Why? David hesitated. 1,000 clever excuses passed through his mind. None of them felt honest. Finally, he shrugged. I believe she was innocent. Renner stared at him like a man examining a defective machine. You believed? Yes, sir. You ignored direct orders? Yes, sir. You sabotaged containment systems? Yes, sir. You allowed a high-value alien prisoner to escape? David nodded. Yes, sir. The admiral folded his arms. You realize this is one of the worst disciplinary violations I have seen in 27 years of service. David cleared his throat. Technically, she had a spaceship parked outside. Renner blinked. You knew that? No, sir. The room fell silent again. One of the legal officers quietly covered his mouth, trying not to laugh. The admiral looked like he might explode. Corporal Hayes, he said coldly, you will be held in military custody while the court-martial process begins immediately. David nodded. That seems fair. Guards moved him toward a seat near the center of the chamber. Outside the station windows, the stars drifted peacefully, completely unaware that one human soldier had just rearranged several very important military plans. As the tribunal officers prepared the proceedings, David leaned back slightly in his chair. Well, he muttered quietly to himself, that went about how I expected. The tribunal chamber had been designed for intimidation. High metallic walls curved upward toward a ceiling filled with glowing data panels. Holographic projectors floated above the central platform, quietly displaying military insignias and legal codes that rotated in slow, deliberate patterns. David sat in the single restraint chair in the center of the room. The chair hummed softly as its magnetic locks secured his wrists and ankles. The device was meant to prevent sudden movements, although David suspected its main purpose was making the prisoner feel like an insect pinned under glass. He examined the restraint band on his wrist. "Comfortable," he muttered again. A nearby guard glanced at him. "You said that earlier." "I'm testing consistency. That's not how prison works." David shrugged. Across the chamber, Admiral Renner stood beside a long console where several legal officers were reviewing files. Their voices were quiet but tense, the kind of whispering that meant very serious consequences were being prepared. One officer tapped the holographic panel. "Security logs confirmed the containment field was manually disabled." "By Hayes," another added. Renner didn't look at David. "Of course it was." David leaned back in the chair slightly. "I'm still here if anyone wants to ask me questions." No one responded. The tribunal chamber doors slid open with a metallic hiss. Two more officers entered, carrying a stack of data tablets. David watched them approach. "So what's the official charge?" he asked. One of the officers glanced at him. "Unauthorized release of a hostile prisoner." "That seems accurate." "Sabotage of containment systems?" "Also accurate." "Endangering station personnel." David tilted his head. "That one feels a little dramatic." The officer stared at him. "You released an enemy operative during wartime." David nodded slowly. "When you say it like that, it does sound worse." The officer returned to the console. A few moments later, Admiral Renner turned toward the center of the chamber. "Corporal Hayes." David straightened slightly. "Yes, sir." "Explain your reasoning." David thought about it. "Which part?" "The part where you ignored direct orders and freed an alien prisoner." "Oh." He cleared his throat. "She didn't seem like a war criminal." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend metal. Renner stared at him. "That is your official explanation." "She also said the evidence against her was fabricated." "And you believed her?" "Yes, sir." Renner folded his arms. "Because she criticized our coffee." "That was not the only factor." One of the legal officers coughed loudly. David glanced toward him. "You have to admit the coffee is terrible." "Hayes," Renner said sharply. "Sir?" "This is not a comedy performance." "Yes, sir." Another officer stepped forward, projecting a holographic image above the central table. The image displayed the Veleran prisoner file. Name, Kestrel, status, escaped. Charges, strategic sabotage, civilian colony attack. David stared at the file again. The same contradictions glowed in the evidence lines. Missing witness data, incomplete battlefield logs. It still felt wrong. Renner noticed his expression. "You still believe she is innocent?" David nodded. "Yes, sir." Renner shook his head slowly. "You released an enemy operative based on instinct. Based on evidence that didn't make sense. You are a soldier, not an investigator." David smiled faintly. "Today I was apparently both." A faint vibration passed through the station floor. The tribunal chamber lights flickered for half a second. Everyone looked up. "What was that?" one officer asked. A technician tapped his console. "External sensor activity." Renner frowned. "Clarify." The technician's eyes widened slightly as he studied the incoming data. "Multiple vessels appearing near the station perimeter." "How many?" "5. No. 7. Renner stepped closer. "Veleran ships?" The technician hesitated. "Yes, sir." The room immediately erupted into overlapping voices. "Combat alert. Defensive positions. Activate shield arrays." David raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said quietly, "that seems like unfortunate timing." Renner shot him a glare. "Silence!" The technician continued scanning. "Wait. What?" "They're not powering weapons." Renner frowned. "Then what are they doing?" The technician adjusted the sensor magnification. "Sir, one of the ships is moving toward the station." "Boarding trajectory?" "No." The technician zoomed the image again. The holographic projection shifted, displaying a sleek silver vessel approaching slowly through the darkness. It was elegant, almost ceremonial. David leaned forward in his chair. That ship looks familiar. Renner ignored him. Open communication channels. The technician complied. A soft tone echoed through the chamber. Then the central holographic display flickered. The image of the approaching vessel stabilized. A moment later, the projection shifted again. Someone was requesting visual transmission. Renner nodded sharply. Accept it. The hologram changed. A tall figure appeared in the center of the chamber. The alien woman stood calmly in brilliant silver armor, her long ears visible beneath dark hair. A delicate crown rested upon her head. The room fell completely silent. Kestrel looked around the tribunal chamber with mild amusement. Then her eyes found David. She smiled slightly. "Hello again," she said. David blinked. "You're wearing a crown now." The holographic projection filled the center of the tribunal chamber with a soft, silver glow. Every officer in the room stared at the figure standing calmly within the transmission field. The alien woman they had imprisoned as a war criminal now wore a crown. Not a decorative ornament, a real one. Metallic, intricate, glowing faintly with energy lines that pulsed like living circuitry. David leaned slightly forward in his restraint chair. "I feel like there's an explanation coming," he said. No one laughed. Admiral Renner stepped toward the projection slowly, his voice suddenly far more careful. "Identify yourself." The alien woman inclined her head slightly. "I believe you already know my name." That prisoner identified herself as Kestrel. "Yes." Renner's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" The alien woman smiled faintly. "Queen Kestrel of the Valeran Sovereign Empire." The silence that followed was powerful enough to stop a rotating planet. One of the legal officers dropped a data tablet. It clattered loudly across the metal floor. David looked around the room. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains the spaceship." Renner ignored him. "Queen Kestrel," the Admiral repeated slowly. "Yes, you expect this tribunal to believe that the prisoner scheduled for execution was the reigning monarch of the Valeran Empire." Kestrel tilted her head slightly. "I expect the tribunal to review the diplomatic data packet I transmitted 30 seconds ago." A technician near the sensor console gasped. "Sir, we just received a classified Valeran diplomatic archive." Renner glanced toward him. "Verify authenticity." "Already checking." The technician's fingers moved rapidly across the console. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Sir, it's genuine." The room erupted into whispers. David raised his hand. "I have a question." No one acknowledged him. He raised his hand higher. "I really feel like someone should acknowledge that I have a question." Renner finally looked at him. "What?" David pointed at the hologram. "You arrested a queen." Renner's jaw tightened. "Yes, that detail is becoming increasingly clear." Kestrel watched the exchange with obvious amusement. "I must admit," she said calmly, "this is one of the more unusual rescue operations I have experienced." David nodded. "That's comforting." Renner stepped closer to the projection. "If you are truly Queen Kestrel, why were you disguised as a Valeran prisoner inside a human military detention facility?" "Because I was conducting covert peace negotiations." The room went silent again. Renner frowned. "With whom?" "With several human diplomatic envoys who preferred not to be assassinated by the anti-peace faction inside my own government." David blinked. "That sounds like a complicated meeting schedule." Kestrel nodded slightly. "It became more complicated when I was captured by individuals who believed executing me would restart the war." Renner turned toward the legal officers. "Cross-reference the prisoner file again." A holographic display appeared above the central table. The war crimes accusations flickered across the screen. Kestrel gestured toward them casually. "Fabricated." The technician continued scanning the diplomatic archive. "Sir, the evidence files in her original charge report have been altered." Renner turned sharply. "Altered how?" "They're partially corrupted. Someone removed key witness data." David leaned back in the restraint chair. "Wow." Renner glared at him. "You already suspected this." David shrugged. "She didn't seem like the mass murder type." Kestrel smiled faintly. "Thank you for that professional character evaluation." Renner turned back toward the hologram. "If you are telling the truth, Queen Kestrel, then Corporal Hayes has accidentally interfered with a major interstellar political operation." David raised a finger. I prefer the phrase heroically improved. Renner ignored him again. Kestrel studied David for a moment. I would actually describe his actions as extremely fortunate. David grinned. I like her version better. One of the legal officers cleared his throat. Sir, technically this tribunal has just detained a foreign head of state. The room became very quiet. Renner closed his eyes briefly. That is diplomatically inconvenient. David nodded. Extremely. The technician at the console suddenly looked up again. Sir, the Valaran fleet outside the station has activated escort formations. Renner frowned. Combat formation? No. The technician zoomed the sensor display. They're forming a ceremonial escort pattern. David blinked. That sounds fancy. Kestrel's holographic image brightened slightly as the transmission stabilized. My advisors insisted on bringing a proper royal escort, she said. Renner looked like a man trying very hard not to scream. Queen Kestrel, why are you contacting this tribunal? She glanced toward David. Because the human soldier responsible for my unexpected escape is currently being placed on trial. David raised both hands. To be fair, I probably deserve some of that. Kestrel shook her head slightly. On the contrary, she stepped closer to the holographic transmitter. The crown on her head shimmered under the projection light. Corporal David Hayes saved my life. Renner stared at her. You are requesting that the charges against him be dismissed. Kestrel smiled again. Not exactly. David frowned. That doesn't sound good. She looked directly at him. I am requesting that Corporal Hayes be reassigned. Renner's expression hardened.